Each generation has to learn the truth all over again. There's a wonderful song in the Garment Workers Union. Every generation, I can't sing it, I'll just say it. But the refrain goes, and every generation has to learn it all over again. Every generation has to learn all over again. The lessons get passed along from one generation to the next. The very first Women's Days, they weren't called Women's History Days, they were called Women's Day, International Women's Days, were back in the early 1900s, before World War I. So this tradition came out of the women's rights movement. And the first activities were in New York City, and significantly, the activities involved garment workers, women who were in the garment trades and who felt that they were not being adequately represented by the men who dominated the labor unions. And they didn't think they were being adequately represented, well, not by the mill owners, not by the garment industry. And they just wanted to be recognized. And this is how the holiday began. I think the year was about 1910, 1911. But then in 1912, something remarkable happened. The women in Lawrence, Massachusetts. How many of you know Lawrence, Massachusetts? Okay. Wow. Okay. Merrimack Valley. That's kind of the northeastern corner of Massachusetts. That's where my mother's family comes from. And the Methuen area, Lawrence, Andover, all those towns, mill towns, most of them, up in that area. Things were very difficult in the industry. And the workers were very divided. I read one history that said that the mill workers represented 51 different ethnic and racial groups. Okay, 51. I find that number incredible. So you had Syrians, Lebanese, Greeks, Italians, French Canadians, Irish, people from England and Scotland, Germany. All of these different nations and different races trying to work together in the same factories, and all of them feeling that they were being ignored and exploited by the mill owners, and ignored and exploited by many others, even people that they wanted to rely upon. Now, to make a long story short, a strike started. The women gathered together, and there were men with them as well, but the workforce was predominantly female. They went out and strike very early in the year, 1912, and it was a very bitter, very difficult strike. And amazingly, very controversial, they won. They actually won, and the victory was celebrated in March of that year. So that strike became identified with Women's Day, and the word went out in all directions, not just in North America, and not just Europe, but even into Asia and other places, that women had gathered together, organized, had won better wages, and they'd also won better working conditions, some measure of respect. And that was just about unprecedented for some of these people. And again, it was especially remarkable that these women from different backgrounds, some of them who could barely talk with each other, they all came together in what was then a celebration of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Fast forward a couple of years, 1917. Russia was in a very difficult position in World War I. It wasn't clear if Russia was winning on the Eastern Front or not, but the war had been dragging on and on and on. There were all kinds of problems on the home front. There were food shortages, problems finding adequate housing. Just finding firewood in cities like Moscow was a struggle. And the government was falling apart. And in the midst of this situation, March 8th, 1917, mostly garment workers, but many women workers in St. Petersburg, Russia, went on strike. And the demand was bread and peace. Bread and peace. Bring the war to an end. Bring the troops home. We want enough to eat. We want to be able to take care of our families. And the strike was incredible. It spread all over St. Petersburg. Then it moved on to other cities. Of course, they had telegraphs and railroads, other ways to communicate. And by the end of 1 week, the Tsarist government had collapsed. The Tsar abdicated, and nobody knew what to do. Nobody had expected that. The socialists, the anarchists, the communists, the various political groups, nobody had thought this was going to happen. And they certainly didn't think it was going to happen because of anything that women did. But it did. And that's how the Russian Revolution started. March 8th, 1917. Now, much later in the year, in October, the Communist Party found ways to take over the revolution, and it took the revolution in a very different direction. But for a few months, 1917, women were widely respected, and in many places, they were very much in charge. I've mentioned bread and roses. Early in the 1900s, there was a poem called Bread and Roses, and once again associated with the women's rights movement of that time. That slogan, Bread and Roses, I can explain it in a few words, I hope. The bread, of course, represents, well, material things. People want enough to eat. Okay? They want adequate housing. They want adequate clothing. Other things that are very materialistic, very basic, and essential for survival. And that's what the bread represents. But the roses, I have a diverse collection in front of me, the roses represent something that is also important. Jesus says, man does not live by bread alone. Well, no gender lives by bread alone. The roses represent dignity. People want to be respected. They want to enjoy life. They even want some luxuries, some appreciation. And so these two things together are important, not just for some people, but for all people, represented by bread and roses. The Lawrence textile strike has become known as the Bread and Roses strike because according to legend, the Bread and Roses song, which you will find in your hymn book, I believe it's 109, but you can check me out on that if you like. The Bread and Roses song, according to legend, was sung during that strike. That song has been sung ever since. Back in the old days, back in 1912, the Unitarians, especially in New England, were very much divided on the strike. There were some who supported the mill owners, and there were people who were mill owners who were in Unitarian congregations. And there were also working people and sympathetic people, particularly at Radcliffe. Radcliffe became a hotbed for support for the Lawrence strike. And a number of Unitarian women were very prominent in supporting the strikers who were up in the Merrimack Valley. So the song became adopted by a number of colleges, especially women's schools. And some of you may have heard it before, the Bread and Roses song. My niece Anna went to Mount Holyoke, and I was present for her graduation. This goes back a few years. And at one point during the ceremonies, all of the different graduates lined up in a big procession. So they started with that particular year's graduates, and then the women from the class before, and the class before that, and the class before that, and all the way back until, I don't know, at least the 1930s or so. One generation. It was a very moving experience. one generation after another. And together they sang, what do you think they sang? Bread and Roses. Okay. We'll sing it in just a few minutes. And there was a man standing next to me, and I'm going to guess that he was a father, maybe he was an uncle, but an older man, with a boy who was probably about 10 years old. And the man said, "Women rule here." And I heard him say that. And I asked Anna, do you know that song? Oh, yeah, she'd heard the song before. Do you know the history? No, it's just an old song. We sing it every now and then. And I said, let me tell you about the history, where that song comes from, and why it is so important to everybody. So in a couple of minutes, we will sing Bread and Roses, and you'll get a sense of what it was like at Mount Holyoke a few years ago, maybe what it was like in 1912 back in Lawrence, and why that song is still sung to this very day. All of March is Women's History Month. It was sort of rediscovered in the 60s, 70s, and then as I recall, about 1975, the United Nations gave it an endorsement. And the holiday has sort of developed ever since then. Something to keep in mind. Now, I said just a few words about roses, and at this point I'm going to talk about bread, and I'm going to bring out a bread basket. And at this point we'll talk a little bit more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we work for some of these things. So I'm going to turn around and reach for the basket. Here it is. Okay. I've got 5 different kinds of bread that I brought with me. And some of these loaves are homemade or made just a few hours ago, and others were purchased at different markets. But what's significant about this bread basket and the contents, different cultures, different ethnic groups, different races are represented here, all together in one place. Now, at the very top, and I hope this doesn't fall down. Okay, it'd be embarrassing if it did. All right. Nancy, maybe you can help me with this. Okay. Okay, you're our bread carrier right now. Okay. All right. This is homemade cornbread. All right. And I made this. Maybe I shouldn't say that. I don't know how you could receive this or not. I do some baking at home, and I particularly like to do quick breads. This cornbread represents the Americas, and not just North America, but really North, South, Central, because, well, what the Indians would have called maize, and many people still call maize, is a staple for many cultures in the Western Hemisphere. This particular cornbread, we call it Caribbean cornbread, and it is gluten-free, and it is vegetarian. There's no eggs, no dairy products in this particular cornbread. We use a banana, believe it or not, as a binder, so you'll taste banana. Coconut milk is used. There's some fresh peppers that are included. So it's a little bit unusual. Some years ago, I think it was back in 2008, the Unitarian Universalist started something called the Ethical Eating Movement for Food Justice. Okay. Actually, this started in Florida at the General Assembly. And we wanted Unitarian Universalists to eat better food. Okay. So all of you eat better food. But we discovered very quickly that it was pointless to just lecture at people all the time. You know, hey, you, did you have a good breakfast today? What about you? You know, that it was much better to show people how to prepare healthy food and then just to sit down and share a community meal together or maybe a coffee hour. Don't tell people, show people what's possible. Especially when we're talking about vegetarianism and veganism and gluten-free items. Show people what's possible. And that explains the cornbread. And we'll share this during the coffee hour. And if you like it, let me know. And If you don't like it, you can talk to Lynn over there, my wife. Okay. All right. Okay. Anyway, so that's the gluten-free cornbread. Okay. Caribbean cornbread. This is from a market. This is the original cornbread, way back when cornbread for the Americas. And of course, these are tortillas. Y'all know tortillas. What can I say about them? Corn has been raised in the Americas, starting in Central America since about 500 BC. I've often wondered, did they grow corn in Central Florida back in the day? And the answer seems to be, for the Tampa area, no, the American Indians in this area did not grow corn, but they used corn. And the corn seems to have been brought in from across the Gulf of Mexico. Can I say that? Is that still around? Okay. All right. Anyway, that body of water that's out there. Okay. Formerly known as the Gulf of Mexico. And also brought down from the north, from what's around Tallahassee and into Georgia. So the Indians in this area had corn, but they did not grow corn. I have struggled to grow corn, and maybe some of you have had success in your backyards, but I find it very difficult. But this represents American Indian traditions, and that's why we include tortillas. Next item. Thank you. Tomorrow is St. Patrick's Day, and this is homemade Irish soda bread. It's actually sort of a Celtic item, not just for Ireland, but for Scotland and many of the Celtic nations. What can I say about this? It is a quick bread. It does not contain yeast. It has both baking powder and baking soda, so there's some very complex chemistry involved. This is a modern recipe, so it includes raisins. That makes it seem very Irish-American. And this is the sort of thing that would be very popular with my family growing up. And for St. Patrick's Day, Lynn and I still make soda bread. And we'll have some of that to share as well, homemade bread. Thank you. Matzos crackers, okay. Very important for the season of Passover. You all know about Matzos crackers. And this year Passover starts April 12th at sundown. And this has some religious significance. Actually, all of these breads are important for religious and cultural reasons. This is mentioned in the Bible, and of course identified with the flight out of Egypt. And I'm sure you've heard the story many times that the Hebrew children didn't have time to wait for the bread to rise, and so they ate unleavened bread. And talk about quick bread. This may be the original quick bread. You know, we got to prepare this very fast, and we got to get out of Egypt, and we got to keep moving. And that's the lesson behind matzahs. Nowadays, we think of them as a kind of cracker because they're easy to store that way. But traditionally, this would have been a fresh, soft bread, probably prepared from wheat, possibly barley. And there are very strict rules about how you prepare this kind of kosher bread, and often used nowadays with various snacks and cream cheese and things like that. The other story about matzos is this is the poor person's bread. That leavened breads back in ancient times were often identified with wealthier people, including the wealthy crowd that was back in Egypt. For much of the year, this is what poor people ate. And it's still regarded as a symbol of equalitarianism. This brings all of us, regardless of social economic class, to the same point during Passover meals. So there's lots of legends that go with matzos. The month of March is important for many Jewish people. Well, for several reasons, but in particularly because of the Purim celebration. Y'all know Purim's story? Okay, that's the great story of women's liberation in the Bible, the book of Esther. So the Jewish people, according to the story, are in exile in Persia. They've been there for a number of years. And the guy who essentially is the prime minister, Haman, plots to kill all the Jews. It's going to be a genocide. But Esther finds out about the conspiracy, and she makes her appeal to the king, and the Jewish people are saved. And the holiday is in honor of Esther, really, and of liberation, and of survival in a very difficult situation. So we think about Esther, and we include her in the Women's History celebrations. I believe Purim this year is March 21st. You might want to check that out. I believe it coincides with springtime, which always seems very significant. And then I have one other display here. Pita bread. Okay. This is also from the Middle East. I've got it upside down. There are many ways to prepare pita bread, and some of the recipes are very, very different from other pita bread recipes. This is the kind of pita bread that you would find in Palestine and in Israel today. So it has a thick side, and it has the pouch. And it's just popular for scooping up all kinds of food, and often enjoyed not just dinners, but parties and other festive occasions. I think you're all familiar with pita bread. It's also very popular with Greek cuisine. The Greeks sometimes call it Arab bread because it's something that they obtained originally from the Middle East, and they associate it with Islam. March is the month, usually, is the month for Ramadan. Ramadan is a great holy month for all Muslims, and according to their stories, this is the month when the Quran, the holy book, was received by Muhammad in a series of visions, and bit by bit the Quran came together. But this is the month when that holy experience is recognized. During the day, there is fasting for most people. Some people are exempted, young people, old people, hospital patients, and others. But most people, most Muslims would fast during the day. And then at night, there are big parties and lots of feasting, which will usually start right around sundown. And this year, all of you Unitarian Universalists are invited to the parties. Okay, so we may have news about that. Okay, what's the news? Oh, speak up? Don't speak up. Further back. Back up. Back up. Okay. Want me to back off? Okay, how's this? This better? All right, very good. All right. Ramadan, what are we going to do? Okay, is that right? Okay, over in St. Petersburg, we're going to have a dinner on Tuesday, March 18th. And we're going to gather at the Coliseum. We've done this every year for a number of years now, we being the Interfaith Tampa Council. And we gather just around sundown, and then there's some presentations that explain the holiday. And then we have a huge meal, and there probably is going to be some pita bread there and some other things. And you're all invited. And if you'd like to join us for this event, just check out Eventbrite. You can find that on your computer. The event is free, but pre-registration is needed because this is a very popular activity. And we will try to have a table for Unitarian Universalists at the St. Petersburg dinner. And there's also a similar event here in Tampa, which I don't know as much about, but I think some of you know how that dinner is going to happen. And if you do, you may want to share the information with friends. But think about Ramadan and why it has become so important for Unitarian Universalists and others to be in solidarity with Muslims. Some are immigrants, of course. Many were born right here in the United States, never left the U.S. All kinds of people are included in Islam, people of different races, different ethnic groups. And it's a very difficult time right now. Very difficult. You don't have to accept Islam in order to stand in solidarity at a moment like this. You're very much needed and very much appreciated. 5 different kinds of bread, all brought together on Bread and Roses Sunday. And the message about diversity, equity, and inclusion, well, it's really very simple. These are hard times. We worry about world peace. We worry about the price of eggs, price of bread, price of housing. We want the dignity of all people to be affirmed. And that includes people who've been bullied, oppressed, pushed aside, sometimes just ignored because of their gender, because of their race, because they don't speak English in the right sort of way, because of their age. People are marginalized for all kinds of reasons. But Unitarian Universalists, well, we continue to speak for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we include religious concerns. We don't expect that everybody's going to think in our sort of way or that everybody's going to crowd into our religious buildings. It really doesn't matter. We speak for human rights, dignity. We speak for bread for all. And we also speak for roses, for respect and appreciation. And that's the DEI message that I bring you this year. And it's very much needed. And let's see if we can work together to make it happen. Blessed be.